The call came at 7:12 a.m. on a Thursday. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table in Portland, Oregon, watching the rain slide down the glass doors that opened to my small backyard. My coffee had gone cold. I'd been staring at my phone for a while, debating whether I should call my father's assisted living center again. Then my sister's name lit up the screen.laure. He hadn't spoken in almost a month. Not since our last tense visit with Dad. Her voice was calm when I answered. Too calm. Emily, she said, drawing my name out slowly, I have some news. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. Dad passed away last night, she continued. Peacefully. In his sleep. For a moment, everything went quiet, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. What? I whispered. That's not possible. I talked to his nurse yesterday. Laura didn't respond to that. The funeral is scheduled for Monday, she said instead. I've already handled everything. I pushed my chair back, my heart pounding. When did this happen? Why didn't anyone call me? There was a pause. Then her voice shifted, less sympathetic, more efficient. And Emily, about Dad's estate. The will was very clear. Everything goes to me. The house. The investment accounts. All of it. I felt dizzy. You get nothing, she added. And before you start thinking about lawyers, don't. It's airtight. Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, my hand shaking. My father was supposedly dead. And my sister's first priority had been making sure I knew I was disinherited. Not I'm sorry. Not he loved you. Just a warning. Something was wrong. Let me go back. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 62 years old, a recently retired environmental consultant. I spent 4 decades working with municipal governments across the Pacific Northwest, helping clean up contaminated land and water. My husband passed away 5 years ago after a sudden stroke. We never had children. After he died, my father became my anchor. Richard Carter, my dad, was 87, sharp-minded, opinionated, and stubborn in the way only former engineers can be. He'd built bridges for most of his career, literal ones, and liked to remind everyone that things didn't collapse if they were designed properly. He lived independently in his home in Lake Oswego until about a year ago. That's when Laura stepped in. My sister is 4 years younger than me. She's charismatic, persuasive, and always chasing the next opportunity. She worked in financial sales, high commissions, high pressure, high risk. Over the years, I'd heard bits and pieces about her money troubles. Deals that fell through. Credit cards shuffled. A lifestyle that didn't quite match her income. At family dinners, Dad used to joke, Laura lives like money grows back overnight. But about 10 months ago, she sat him down and told him he needed help managing things. You're not as sharp as you used to be, Dad, she'd said gently. Let me handle the paperwork. Just in case. She suggested becoming his power of attorney. Dad hesitated. He wasn't senile. He was still driving, still reading technical journals, still beating everyone at crossword puzzles. But Laura insisted. And eventually, he agreed. That was when everything changed. Within weeks, Dad was suddenly diagnosed with advanced cognitive decline. Laura moved him into Cedar Ridge Assisted Living, claiming it was temporary. When I visited him there, I barely recognized the man who had raised me. He sat slumped in a chair, staring past me. His words came slowly, fragmented. Sometimes he didn't recognize me at all. It can happen fast at his age, the attending physician told me smoothly, but it didn't feel right. Still, I visited 3 times a week. I talked to him, read to him, held his hand even when he didn't seem to know who I was. Laura came too, but rarely. And when she did, she was always in a hurry. Now, standing alone in my kitchen with rain tapping against the glass, her words echoed in my head. Everything goes to me. You get nothing. I grabbed my phone and called Cedar Ridge. I'm calling about my father, Richard Carter, I said when someone finally answered. I was just told he passed away last night. There was a pause. I'm sorry, Mom, the nurse replied carefully, but your father is alive. He's in the dining room right now. My breath caught. I see, I said slowly. Could you please not tell anyone I called? When I hung up, my hands were shaking. My father wasn't dead. Which meant my sister had lied, and if she was lying about that, I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Laura's voice replayed in my head, calm, confident, final. Dad passed away. Everything goes to me. You get nothing. By morning, the rain had stopped, but my chest still felt tight. I drove straight to Cedar Ridge Assisted Living. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Not Laura. Not the staff. I wanted to see my father with my own eyes, without warning, without preparation. The receptionist smiled politely when I signed in. Visiting Mr. Carter, she asked. Yes, I said, I'm his daughter. She checked the screen and nodded. He's in the activity room right now. They're doing puzzles. Puzzles. My father loved puzzles. I walked down the hallway slowly, every step heavy with disbelief. When I reached the open doorway, I stopped. Dad was sitting at a table with 3 other residents, glasses perched on his nose, carefully fitting pieces together. His hands were steady. His posture upright. He looked normal. Not confused. Not distant. Not dying. He looked up when he heard footsteps. Emily, he said. My throat closed. Dad, I managed. He stood up immediately, knocking his chair back. What are you doing here? Is something wrong? I crossed the room in 3 steps and hugged him. He hugged me back, tight, familiar, real. You're alive, I whispered. He pulled away, frowning. Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be? I took a breath. Laura called me yesterday. She said you passed away. His face changed. Not confusion. Anger. She said what? We sat in a quiet corner of the lounge while residents continued their activities around us. I told him everything, the call, the will, the warning. Dad listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every sentence. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a slow breath. I knew something was off, he said finally. But I didn't think she'd go that far. He told me what had really been happening. Laura had insisted on managing his finances, temporarily. She'd brought doctors he'd never met before. Paperwork he was told was routine. They said I was having memory problems, he said. But every time I asked for specifics, they changed the subject. Then came the medications. They told me it would help me sleep. Instead, it made him foggy. Slow. Disoriented. That's when she moved me here, he said quietly. Said it was safer. I felt sick. Dad, I said carefully, did you sign anything recently? Anything about your estate? He nodded. A new will. Laura said the old one was outdated. My heart sank. Do you remember what it said? He hesitated. She told me it divided things fairly. I trusted her. That was the moment I realized something important. Laura hadn't just lied to me. She had been building a case. A narrative. One where Dad was incompetent, and she was in control. I asked to speak to the facility director. In her office, I explained the situation calmly, sticking to facts. My sister falsely reported my father's death, I said. I'm concerned about possible financial abuse. The director's expression hardened. We take allegations like that very seriously, she said. And I should tell you, your sister has restricted access to your father's records. She's listed herself as the primary decision maker. Of course she had. That afternoon, I made 2 calls. The first was to a lawyer specializing in elder law. The second was to a private investigator. Because if Laura thought I was going to walk away quietly, she didn't know me at all. The investigator's name was Daniel Reeves. He was in his late 40s, former law enforcement, the kind of man who spoke little and listened carefully. We met at a quiet cafe near the river, far from Cedar Ridge. I laid everything out, Laura's call, the fake death claim, the sudden will change, the medications. Daniel didn't react much. That worried me. When I finished, he finally said, "This isn't new. I've seen this pattern before." He explained it simply. Step 1, isolate the parent. Step 2, question their competence. Step 3, control access, medical, financial, social. Step 4, move the assets. And the fake death? I asked. That, he said, means she's close to the end game. He asked for permission to dig into Laura's financial history and Dad's recent accounts. I signed everything he put in front of me. Within 48 hours, he called me. "You need to come see this." We met again, this time in his office. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were bank statements, transaction logs, and screenshots. Over the past 8 months, large sums had been moved out of Dad's primary investment account, always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic alerts. The money hadn't disappeared, it had gone to a shell LLC called North Shore Consulting Group. Registered to Laura. My stomach twisted. "She set it up 6 months ago," Daniel said. "Same week your father signed the new power of attorney documents. There was more. Credit cards in Dad's name I'd never seen before, loans opened against the house he no longer lived in, and payments to 2 medical consultants whose licenses didn't exist. Fake doctors. That cognitive decline diagnosis," Daniel continued. "It was based on evaluations from one of them. I thought of Dad, slumped in that chair months ago, barely able to finish a sentence. The medication. I felt cold all over." "What about the will?" I asked. Daniel flipped to another page. The new will was notarized by a mobile notary hired by Laura. No independent witnesses. No video documentation. He looked up at me. "It's contestable." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. That evening, I went back to Cedar Ridge. Dad was sitting by the window, reading. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deny it. When I finished, he closed his book slowly. "She always wanted things fast," he said quietly. "Money, success, validation." He looked at me. "I didn't think she'd steal from me." "You didn't lose your mind," I said. "They made you look like you did." He nodded. That night, we made a plan. A careful one. Because Laura still believed 2 things, that our father was incompetent, and that I didn't know the truth. We decided not to confront her yet. Instead, we let her keep talking. Let her keep lying. Because people, who think they've already won, make mistakes. And Laura was about to make a very public one. 3 days later, Laura sent out the invitations. Not to me, of course, but to extended family, former colleagues, old neighbors, anyone who had ever known our father. A memorial service, she wrote. Private. Closed casket. Respectfully brief. She even included a short paragraph about how hard the past year had been, how grateful she was to have supported Dad through his decline. Reading it made my hands shake. She was grieving a man who was very much alive. Daniel warned us not to interfere yet. "Let her finish," he said. "The more elaborate the lie, the harder it is to defend." Dad agreed. "I want to see how far she's willing to go," he said quietly. We arranged for him to remain at Cedar Ridge, but under a new attending physician, one assigned through an external provider. The old medications were stopped. Within days, the fog lifted. His voice steadied. His humor returned. His memory sharpened. Meanwhile, Laura's performance intensified. She posted online tributes, shared childhood photos, accepted condolences. She called me once. Left a voicemail. "I don't know why you're avoiding me," she said softly. "But Dad wouldn't want us fighting." The audacity of it almost impressed me. The lawyer filed an emergency motion to suspend Laura's power of attorney, citing financial irregularities and medical coercion. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing after the memorial. Perfect timing. The service was held at a rented hall overlooking the river. I arrived early with Daniel, the lawyer, and 2 uniformed officers. Dad came separately. He wore a navy blazer and a tie he'd owned for 20 years. He looked thinner than before, but unmistakably himself. We waited in a side room. Through the door, I could hear Laura speaking, her voice trembling just enough. My father was a brilliant man, she said. But in the end, his mind betrayed him. Dad closed his eyes. Then the director announced a brief pause before the closing remarks. That was our cue. We walked in together. The room went silent. Someone gasped. A woman dropped her program. Laura froze at the podium, her face draining of color, as she stared at the man she had buried alive. "Hello, Laura," Dad said calmly. "I hear I missed my own funeral." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And in that moment, every lie she'd built began to collapse under its own weight. For a moment, no one moved. Laura's hands gripped the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes darted around the room, family members, old coworkers, friends who had shown up to mourn a man now standing 10 feet away from her. Alive. This isn't funny," she said finally, forcing a shaky laugh. "Emily, what is this? Some kind of sick joke?" Dad didn't raise his voice. "I'm not the one who told people I was dead," he replied. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "I thought he passed last week." Another voice, "She told us he'd been declining for months." Laura stepped away from the podium, shaking her head. "He's confused," she said quickly. "This is exactly what the doctors warned about. He has moments like this." That was Daniel's cue. He stepped forward and addressed the room calmly. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm a licensed private investigator. I've been working with Mr. Carter and his legal counsel." The lawyer followed, holding a folder thick with documents. "We have medical evaluations conducted within the last 10 days, she said. "They show Mr. Carter is fully competent." Laura's face flushed. "You can't just barge in here and accuse me," she snapped. "I did everything for him." "Everything." "You did," Dad said. "Including stealing from me." The word hung in the air. The lawyer opened the folder and began to speak, slowly, deliberately. "Unauthorized transfers. Fraudulent medical evaluations. A forged narrative of cognitive decline." As she spoke, the officers moved closer to Laura, not touching her, just present. Laura's confidence crumbled. "This was temporary," she insisted. "I was protecting him. Emily doesn't understand money. She never has." I finally spoke. "You told me he was dead," I said. "You disinherited me before you even finished stealing." Her eyes met mine for the first time. And for a split second, I saw fear. Real fear. The memorial ended abruptly. People left in stunned silence. Some avoided Laura's gaze. Others stared openly. The officers asked her to step aside. She didn't resist. That night, the story spread through the family faster than any obituary ever could. By morning, Laura's accounts were frozen. By the end of the week, formal charges were filed. Elder financial abuse, fraud, identity misuse. Dad moved out of Cedar Ridge 2 weeks later. As for Laura, she stopped calling. But the story wasn't over yet. Because consequences don't end with exposure. They end with truth. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Once the accounts were frozen and the medical fraud uncovered, everything Laura had built her case on collapsed. The false diagnoses were withdrawn. The revised will was suspended. The power of attorney was formally revoked. In court, Laura looked smaller than I remembered. No confident smile. No persuasive tone. Just a woman sitting alone, staring at the table in front of her. She pleaded not guilty. Her lawyer argued that she had acted in her father's best interest. That the financial transfers were temporary reallocations. That the funeral announcement was a miscommunication. The judge wasn't persuaded. The evidence was overwhelming. The shell company, the forged evaluations, The recorded phone call, where she told me our father was dead. When the verdict came, it was quiet. Guilty on all major counts. Laura was sentenced to several years in state prison, followed by probation and full financial restitution. She never looked at me when the judge read the sentence. Dad was released back into his home under supervised care, not because he needed it, but because he wanted peace. His strength returned slowly, steadily, the way bridges are tested before reopening. One afternoon, we sat together on his back porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. I failed her, he said suddenly. You trusted her, I replied. That's not failure. He nodded, but I knew the guilt would stay with him longer than the anger ever could. As for the inheritance, Dad rewrote his will. Carefully. Transparently. He left most of his estate to charities, supporting elder protection and legal advocacy. Some went to me. Some to causes he believed in, and none of it to Laura. People ask me now how I felt when my sister told me I would get nothing. I tell them this: she was right. I didn't inherit money. I inherited the truth. And sometimes, that's the most valuable thing there is.